Yeah.
Alrighty, we have one more question here. Pretty big question. How do I
This is a big
explain
one.
things without info dumping?
I'm gonna let you go first on this one.
All right, my gut instinct and like my guiding principle for 88% of my writing, show don't tell. It's the go-to thing when I don't know what to say but want to sound smart. It's but it's true. I think the more that you can show something, and I think a lot about world building when we talk about info dumping, but we also can talk about or include character traits or personalities, goals, motivations, backstory, that sort of stuff. The more that you show the reader that through actions or dialogue or reactions or thoughts or what have you, the less info dumping you're going to have to do. I think there is a place for some info dumping in some genres. I'm lucky enough to write in fantasy where people don't mind a little exposition taking up a couple
Right.
paragraphs here and there. But if you're writing like an action thriller, that info dumping is just going to slow your book down to a crawl, and people aren't going to want it. They're there for the high octane adrenaline, right?
Right.
And they're not there for this. I mean, they're there for a fun world, but not like a made up high fantasy style of world where they actually want to know more beyond the character. But I've said before, give us the character's perspective as they come into a city and let them observe things and have reactions to things that are going on in this new city as a way to show us the world building and as a way to show us their own internal thoughts and backstory. Right? If they turn away and shy away from like an authority figure, for example, maybe they have something to hide. Maybe they've had a run-in with the law in the past. That gives us more information without them saying, "I turned away from the police because of my past with law enforcement." That's clunky. That's not fun to
Right.
read. Right?
Right.
That's my go-to is show
Yeah.
don't tell.
Well, and maybe a decent example of that is something I've been thinking about for my new challenge book that I'm writing is I have a town that used to be a bustling blue collar factory town, and the factory shut down. A lot of these jobs were lost and shipped off to another country, and then you've got this group of people that are then figuring out what they're going to do with themselves, and it becomes a tourist attraction. And so, but instead of telling all of that history of the town and all of that, I've been thinking of ways to show that. And one thing that I'm doing is I'm going to have a couple of characters that are going around the town, and there's some dilapidated buildings, and there's kind of the main town square where everything that's shiny and pretty and inviting.
Mhm.
But when you get off of that, there's a lot of things that are in disrepair and abandoned and that sort of thing. And one way you could do that is have a conversation between characters who are maybe driving through, touring, or whatever, and they start talking about why the centerpiece of the town is one way, but when you get off of that, it's a whole
I like
different
that.
thing. And you can start talking about the history of the town and how these families moved out, and this thing was fallen in disrepair because it's not the shiny thing that goes on brochures. And and you can tell the history of the town through through enlightening one character to another of the history of it without just dryly stating, a history class dissertation on the fall of this town.
Mhm.
And that's one way you could do it. One thing I've specifically been thinking about.
Yeah. There are also fun ways you can do it. And I read, what is the name of the book? It's a Jay Kristoff series, the Nevernight series,
Mm.
and the series is told from the perspective of the narrator as if the narrator is writing the book, like a character in that world writing a book about the events. And so there are footnotes in the book, and there are cute little asides about like world building things, about historical things or monsters that they come across or whatever. And that I don't want every book to do that because I think that would get dry real quick, but something quirky like that was actually a lot of fun for me.
Yeah.
Now, On the other hand, there are going to be some people who hate that and say, why are there footnotes in this? This is the dumbest thing I've ever seen in my life. So, it worked for me, but it might
Yeah,
not work for everyone. But there are different ways that you can go about it stylistically if you do want to add more exposition to your world. But I think showing, not telling, as like the case that you just gave there, is probably the best way to get around info dumping.
yeah,
Um, and like I'm honestly struggling to think of other ways to do it. It's just like you want your character to experience these things and to share their perspective, because
right.
their perspective is what makes it worth reading. That's how we connect to them. That's how they become likable,
Yeah.
right? To wrap it back around.
Yeah, and if you're, especially if you're doing like a NaNoWriMo project where you're wanting to land close to the 50,000 word mark, um, you honestly, if you start plotting it out and you have a few different plot points in your novel, 50,000 words doesn't leave you a lot of room to
Mhm.
info dump a lot of stuff. You need to find ways you can get information across to the reader while keeping the story moving and keep pushing forward with it without just taking up pages and pages. We've used this example before, but there's a point in one of the Wheel of Time books where Robert Jordan spends 3 pages talking about buttons on someone's jacket. 3 pages describing buttons. You could do that so much more quickly. Yeah, yeah,
I will say too, Josh mentioned this yesterday in our 6-day event. Josh Hayes, our guest host during this challenge, that when he world builds, he only builds or he only plans what is necessary for the plot. So he said if there's going to be a pursuit scene and he knows he wants to do it through the streets of a South American town, then he'll go and look at South American towns for inspiration. But he's not going to develop this town
right.
before knowing that it's going to be relevant. And so I think, especially when you get to the speculative fiction genres like sci-fi and fantasy, we love world building, right? It's one of the draws to that genre, and we will happily world build to our like beyond the page.
Right.
That's where it starts to get dangerous, because you then put in all this work and you're so passionate about this place, you want to put more into the story. So especially if you're doing something like the 60-day challenge or NaNoWriMo, focus on what's relevant to the story first and just focus on that. You can add in more details after,
Yeah.
but then you can make sure as you're revising, hey, this is relevant here, and now I'm going to add it, rather than just giving us a spiel about the local delicacies because some fish is from the river that's not available somewhere else, but the characters don't
Right.
even eat the fish.